we're back with another episode of App Stories. Today's show is brought to you by ZocDoc. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Vitici. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing really well. It is Automation April, and
Sure.
I thought that we ought to start off the show today with a little recap. What's going on with shortcuts and Automation April? Because we're 1 week into this now. We last Monday kicked off with the Automation April Shortcuts contest.
Okay, where can people go to find this contest?
They can go to shortcuts.macstories.net
Easy.
to find that.
Okay.
It's super easy. And so you can submit 2 shortcuts. You can edit them all the way up until the deadline for submitting your shortcuts, which is April 17th. So you still got a little time there. And you can go there, and we got some great prizes because for the best overall winner this year, we have both a Loopdeck Live S and a CalDigit hub, a Thunderbolt 4 hub, which is a pretty cool prize. Plus, we've got a bunch of other things, some subscriptions to Club Mac Stories that we're giving away and all that kind of thing. So we started with that. You wrote a big story, and I wrote a big story last week, which we're going to talk about on the show today. Plus, in the newsletter for Club Mac Stories Weekly, we had some interviews with a couple of our judges for this year's contest, as well as a behind-the-scenes look at your S-GPT shortcut and some other things that were kind of fun. I did an article on email and how you can how you can automate email and how you really can't automate email, because email is one of the, I think, the most frustrating areas of automation on Apple platforms at the moment. But yeah, a lot going on and a lot more coming up.
Yes, and I would encourage everybody, whether you submitted a shortcut last year for Automation April or not, whether you're new to all of this, I would encourage you to not overthink your shortcuts. If you think you got something that works well for you, if you think, hey, this is a shortcut that maybe can be useful to other people, don't feel shy about submitting them. We're looking for all kinds of shortcuts, from the more complex to the simpler ones. That's why we have multiple categories. That's why we are open to all kinds of submissions. And again, you have until April 17th. So you still have about a week or so, I think, to submit your shortcuts. And also stay tuned for, obviously more content on Mac Stories, but also we are going to do a special workshop on Discord, live on Discord for our members, where I and John, maybe some other guests, will talk about some shortcuts techniques and some of the best approaches to, design shortcuts and when to, like, for example, how to identify areas of your workflow that maybe could be automated with shortcuts, and sounds easy, but it's a surprisingly tricky problem when you need to sit down and evaluate how you get work done and what parts of your workflow could maybe use some automation.
Yes, absolutely. And, look, if you want to join the club and get on the fun there, you can go to plus.club. And there you'll find all the details about all the plans that we have for the various tiers of the club, as well as Premier, which includes a subscription to App Stories Plus, which is the extended version of the show that's delivered early and ad-free, which we talked a little bit about the backstory of S-GPT and some of the stuff we've got going on and how we're reorganizing our shortcuts libraries and other topics. So, Federico, with that, I think we ought to dive into these 2 stories. Where should we start today, do you think?
I want to start from yours, and I want you to describe this whole thing, this whole workflow about links that you created. Like, I want you to start from the beginning. Like, how did this start in the first place?
So this started because I've always been frustrated by the way I collect links. I collect them either in too many places, or they're somehow disorganized, or I try to do too much. Because one of the problems is, it came down to analyzing my process for coming about links and collecting them. Because what I do more often than not is I'm in an RSS client and I'm scanning through dozens of headlines. And I'll see things that catch my eye for whatever reason. Maybe it's something I want to put in the newsletter for the club. Maybe it's something I want to write about on Mac Stories. Maybe it's something I just want to read in my spare time because it's interesting to me. It could be, a bunch of different things. And if I stopped at any one point to take that link and both save it somewhere and also tag it or file it or do whatever to keep it organized, it would take me out of the flow of going through the links. And, it may only take a few seconds to do that, to kind of do that organization in the moment. But I was finding that given how many links I go through in a day, I was either half doing it or it was interrupting what else I wanted to get done, or I would never get to the end of the links, or I'd wind up with a bunch of tabs in Safari because whatever app I was using didn't, connect with the app that I wanted to save the link in. It was just a whole mess of problems. So what I started with was figuring out what are the apps that I want to use, a core set of apps that I want to use for this process, and can I connect them with shortcuts or with just built-in features? Because, if you have a built-in feature, you don't need shortcuts. And this is kind of the combination that I came up with. It was a combination of dealing with existing features in these apps, as well as a handful of shortcuts that are really pretty simple, but they're the glue that holds it all together. So I started off with the premise that I really wanted to use Reader, Reeder, for my RSS reading. I was willing to consider other feed readers because there are others that I like. I used Reekit for months last year and into this year. And I like others like Lear and Fiery Feeds. But I've always preferred Reader's UI and design. So if possible, I wanted to use that one. And one of the things that's really nice about Reader is that it integrates really well with the share menu on the Mac, because most of this link collection that I do is at my desk during the day. It's really not as big a problem from a workflow standpoint on iOS or iPadOS, because there you've got a share sheet, and the share sheet is so fundamental to so many apps on those platforms that no matter where you find a link, whatever app it happens to be in, whether you're in Safari or Reader or wherever, you can almost always pull up a share sheet and send it somewhere to save the link. That's not really true on the Mac, because the share menu is kind of a shadow of what the share sheet is on iOS. And that's where I ran into my first problem. Was the apps that I wanted to use for collection are two. One is Raindrop, and I chose Raindrop because raindrop.io, because it is web-based, which means it'll sync automatically in the background everywhere. And it has an API that I want to play with, because it does things like it allows you to highlight articles in Raindrop, and then you can send them off to places like Obsidian. And I wanted to use Matter for Read Later. And so neither one of those apps, though, works with the share menu in Reader.
Okay.
And that was kind of the core initial problem that I had to solve for. And with Matter's a weird case, because Matter, the app is compatible with M Series Macs. So you can actually open the app and its action will show up in the share menu, but it doesn't work with every app, and it doesn't happen to work with Reader. I actually got it to work with Lear, but it didn't work with Reader. So what I did was, and basically my process is I dump everything into raindrop.io, and without any kind of tags or anything, because it goes directly into an unsorted bin, which is a special built-in category in raindrop.io. And then once or twice a day, I kind of go in there and I say, oh, this is for weekly. Oh, this is for personal reading. I decide where it goes quickly and send it off. And I can do that usually on my iPhone or something and use the share sheet, and it's very quick. With getting it into raindrop.io, though, the problem I ran into was that there is no share menu option for raindrop.io, but it has a URL scheme.
Ooh, okay.
And all right, so it has a URL scheme, and Reader has a built-in action for copying a link that you can set a keyboard shortcut to. So what I did was very simple. I set a keyboard shortcut for copying the link in Reader. Then I set up a shortcut that I tied to both a button on the Loop Deck Live S, which is one of our prizes for the contest
Yes.
in Automation April. I set up a button there, and I set up a keyboard shortcut, and I set up in Raycast too, so I can kind of do it wherever I do. I usually use Raycast more than anything else, but what it does is it uses AppleScript to trigger that keyboard shortcut that I set up to copy the link, and then it drops that link into the URL scheme for raindrop.io.
And what happens then? So,
then the shortcut opens the link, which opens it in a tab in Safari. Okay. And so that's a little bit like a little mini UI for the
so it opens like a little clipper on the web.
Yes, it opens in a tab. It's very much like the Raindrop extension for Safari, but it's in a tab. And so it opens it up. And if I wanted to, I could stop there and I could like fill in details because it has fields for things like tags and categories and that kind of thing. Categories are like folders on Raindrop. And instead, though, what I do is I trigger another Apple script that does Command W, closes the tab, and then has an open app action that reopens Reader. So and there's a 3-second pause in there because I have to make sure that the tab fully opens and the URL gets dropped into the correct field. There's no save or anything. It's all automatic. Once this tab opens with the Raindrop clipper, it automatically saves from Raindrop. So all I have to do is...
you don't have to confirm anything.
No, I don't have to confirm anything, which is what makes it so easy. Is all I have to do is then close the tab to tidy up my Safari window, and then go back to Reader. And the whole thing takes 3 seconds, and I can continue down the list. If I come across something that I'm like, oh, this is definitely a read later thing. Maybe it's pleasure reading. I know right away this is not something I'm gonna I want to have in Raindrop. I do something similar, but with Matter. And what Matter has, because it is compatible with the M series chips, it does have a shortcuts action that says save to Matter or add to Matter, I think it's called, right? So this is an even simpler shortcut. All I have to do is the same Apple script to copy the link, and then I send that link directly into Matter and send myself a confirmation that it's saved. So what this is allowing me to do is it's only saving maybe a few seconds ever at one time, but it's keeping me in Reader going through this long list of headlines so I can do it really quickly and efficiently, and then worry later about where does this go? Does this go to the club? Does it go to the website? Is it something that I just want to read myself? Whatever it happens to be. Okay. It makes it really, really handy that way.
Okay. So you're using tags to organize all of this, but you also have that unsorted collection in Raindrop. Right. How often do you go in there and sort of manage your unsorted collection? Like, is that
about once a day?
Oh, so it's a daily thing you do. You just
Okay. Yeah, typically it's a daily thing. I mean, I might go in there earlier if I know that I put something in there that maybe I want to link to that day. I'll go in earlier, but for the most part, towards the end of the day, because I can just get like my iPad Mini and start going through these links towards the end of the day and say, oh, this is going to be in the interesting links section of Weekly, and this is something I'm going to read tonight later on, and that kind of thing. So I'll do it in like the late afternoon usually. Right. Is when I'll do that. Yeah.
So one of the things I want to understand after reading your column is, so what's the process for, let's say on Friday, you are sitting down to assemble the interesting links section from Mac Stories Weekly. You go on Raindrop and you filter by the weekly tag and you find all those links. Once you have sort of covered them, right? In the newsletter, so you've written down the section. What happens to those links in Raindrop?
Those typically will get deleted.
Oh, you just delete them. I should have known because you're not an archival person.
No, I am archiving more, but I feel like I kind of take a similar approach that I do to Gmail, where it's like, sure, I could archive every single email that's sent to me, but if I delete the ones that are just junk, then when I go back to search, I'm less likely to get results that include the junk. So if it's something that's just not a long-term interesting thing to me, I'll just delete it. But some of them I'll save, but most of them I'll for like something like Weekly, I'll delete. But I'm doing more I think with for instance, something that ends up in Matter that I'm just reading for my own personal knowledge or whatever, or it's part of a research project, a lot of those at the end of the day will end up in an archival spot in Raindrop at this point. The other thing I set up, which is designed to deal with when I get really busy, is there are going to be times when I just don't get to those unsorted links. And some of them, it's kind of inevitable. It's like email. You'll end up with too many links and not enough time to review them. And what I set up was what I call the link lost and found, where I can just take all those links. It's kind of an archive, but not entirely an archive. Drag them in there, and they'll still be available in Raindrop for search. I mean, that's one of the nice things about Raindrop, if you have a paid account, is that it's got full text search. So I'll be able to go in and find all that information in the future if I think, oh, I remember I saved this thing, but it didn't end up in it, didn't end up with the correct tag or whatever. I can still find it that way. It'll still be in the bin, but not in what I consider the inbox, which is the unsorted section.
And the Raindrop app was recently updated on iOS and
iPadOS. It was, yes.
To be like a full-on Swift UI sort of experience. How's the new app compared to the old one?
It's really nice. It's really nice. It's got all the context menus and everything, which is one of the reasons it's so fast to process links now. I mean, that's one reason I use iOS to do that part of it, because the Mac app is okay. It's pretty good, but it's still not... It's not a native app like iOS and iPadOS is, and I really prefer, being able to use the share button or especially the context menus to add tags or move things between categories. It's really, really quite nice.
Do you know if the developer is working on a Mac
version?
I
don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I have not heard one way or the other. But I was going to say, I keep the structure pretty loose, though. The whole thing about this is, there is full text search with Raindrop, which is a real big benefit because you don't have to worry too much about getting granular about the organization. Right. I have tags, and I have a handful of collections. There's like a Mac Stories collection with a few categories that I use for different things that we do at the site. And there's also like a personal one, and there's the lost and found that I mentioned. But beyond that, I don't use many more. I just, I rely on search.
So what's I guess I want to understand, like, what's the difference? Sort of, how do you make a decision if you stumble up? And I think this is actually a good conversation to have, regardless of automation. When you stumble upon something, like an article, that you think it's good for the newsletters or it's good for work, but it's also something that you find interesting. What's the process for deciding whether it goes to Raindrop or whether it goes to Matter in that case?
Yeah, a lot ends up in Matter regardless. Okay. A lot of times things end up in both places. It ends up in Raindrop for archival purposes, and it ends up in Matter. It ends up in Matter because I just find it a pleasant reading experience. It's a better reading experience than Raindrop, although Raindrops is not bad. So, if it's interesting if it cuts across different areas, I guess is kind of what you're asking. It may end up in a category, but with a different tag. It's hard to declare hard boundaries around those kind of things. Instead, what I do is I make sure if it's something that's going to be in the newsletter, for instance, I'll put the weekly tag on it. But if it's personal interest and I still want to keep it, I'm not going to delete it like I said I often do. I'll just take the weekly tag off of it and put it in the archive, whether it's in the archive in Raindrop or in Matter. Matter just happens to be the place that I like to read. So I move things in there to do the reading, and then I leave them in Raindrop for organizing more than anything else. I don't use Matter as kind of like a link organizer because it's okay for that. I mean, it has tagging itself, but I don't want to organize things in two different places.
Got it. Okay. You shared the shortcuts on Mac Stories. I liked how you were able to sort of simulate a hotkey on macOS using AppleScript. And I think it's kind of funny that, shortcuts for Mac, when did it come out? 2 years ago at this point?
Yeah.
And still AppleScript continues to be the only sort of built-in way in shortcuts for Mac to simulate clicking a specific combination of keys. which
Yep. Yep.
I think is both funny and sad at the same time.
The other thing that's funny and sad is that I cannot get keyboard shortcuts to stick in the
uh,
shortcuts for Mac app
you
at
were
all.
texting me about this a few nights ago.
Yeah, it's just completely broken. And so what I use is Raycast instead, because Raycast integrates shortcuts and you can set both an alias and a keyboard shortcut that's a Raycast keyboard shortcut. And then that's the keyboard shortcut that I'm using essentially to trigger these things, not something I set up in the shortcut itself, because it's more reliable.
Yeah, and I don't think you take advantage of this feature in your story, but one of the things I love about Raycast on macOS is how it lets you assign hotkeys to shortcuts. It lets you assign
Right.
aliases to shortcuts, but it also, I think it also supports passing inputs to shortcuts, right? Or is that
Yeah, it
launch
does.
bar? No, it supports
No,
sending. Yeah.
yeah, it works in Raycast now too. They didn't initially, but it
They
does
didn't
now.
initially, yes, because I remember initially it was only like a launch bar feature where you could
Right.
trigger a shortcut and then press maybe tab to say, I'm typing like this sentence and it's going to be the text input for a shortcut. But I
Right.
recall that Raycast later also added this functionality. So, like,
Yep.
that's exactly the sort of feature that Spotlight should have on macOS. I mean, arguably, Spotlight should have it everywhere, especially on iPadOS as well, but that's a broader topic that maybe we're going to talk about in our wishlist episode. But yeah, I just love Raycast as a UI for triggering shortcuts. You have one something I want to call out from your shortcuts is you asked me, hey, what do you think of these shortcuts to pull the title of a page from
Right.
the URL of a page? And while it's possible to do that in shortcuts, if you have a URL, you can do, for example, get name. You can use the get name action and assign it to a link. And shortcuts, in theory, should be able to figure out, okay, the user wants to have the title of the web page. Or you can do things like, if the input for the share sheet is a Safari web page, give me the title of the web page. In my experience, though, it's obviously very useful to be able to say, I just have a link and I want to get the title of this page without actually opening the web page in my browser. In my experience, it's been much more reliable, and it's why I suggested to you that you use the same action, to use an action from a third-party app called Actions. We covered this one before on App Stories and
We have.
Mac Stories Weekly. And it's got a get title from URL action, which in my tests over the past year has been much, much more reliable than the built-in Apple method for retrieving titles of web pages starting from a URL alone. And it does a better job than Apple's built-in options for this, especially if the web page has special characters in the title, like an ampersand, for example, or double quotes, curly quotes, that sort of stuff. It does a much better job than shortcuts alone.
Yeah, that is absolutely true, because I did some experiments and I had always used the name parameter on, the built-in shortcuts one in the past, because a lot of times I had built shortcuts that were doing things like generating links from Mac Stories pages where it works fine, but a lot of the other websites I tested would end up with a blank title field, but Actions does a much better job with that. I think, Federico, the very last thing I would mention that I think people should keep an eye out for is the upcoming feature of Obsidian called bookmarks.
Okay, you've been trying to sell me hard on this one. So, okay, all right.
I have. All right. So bookmarks are great in the sense that these are very much like, you can bookmark individual notes that you've created, which I've done a lot of that. But one of the things was really intriguing to me is that you can bookmark search results. So you can basically have saved searches in Obsidian. This is in beta on the Mac only right now. But one of the things I did is, because I'm reading some of these articles in Matter that are saved for weekly, I can make sure they're tagged for Mac Stories Weekly. And then I can highlight some of the text to remind myself what that link was all about. And then at the end of the week, I have a saved search now that looks in a particular path where I keep my matter highlights and looks for a particular tag, which is Mac Stories Weekly. And right there, I'll have all the highlights. And it's just a bookmark that I keep in the sidebar, sitting there waiting with the highlights that are accumulating during the course of the week, ready for me when I'm writing the newsletter.
Very cool. All right.
It's a nice feature. I hope it comes to mobile soon.
Yeah.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by ZocDoc. If you've ever stewed over a health problem that you have, you know the temptation to text a pal or even a whole group chat to get your friend's opinion. But you're extremely unlikely to find quality medical advice in a group chat. But you can find it from a doctor on ZocDoc. Thousands of medical professionals on ZocDoc are there to help you. They listen like a friend and give you the expert advice you need. ZocDoc is the only free app that lets you find and book doctors who are patient-reviewed, take your insurance, are available when you need them, and treat almost every condition under the sun. It really wasn't all that long ago that I moved to North Carolina, and when I moved here, I had to change all of my family's doctors. It was a lot of work, but you know what? ZocDoc helped make that a lot easier because I could go in, find the kind of specialists and general practitioners that we needed for our family very quickly and get appointments. Plus, I could tell whether our insurance covered them. It was a really easy way to solve what would have otherwise been a pretty cumbersome process. When you're not feeling your best and just trying to hold things together, finding great care shouldn't take up all of your energy. That's where ZocDoc comes in. Using their free app with millions of users to rely on, you can find the right doctor that meets your needs and fits your schedule. Book an appointment with a few taps in their app and start feeling better faster with ZocDoc. Go to ZocDoc.com/appstories and download the ZocDoc app for free. Then find and book a top-rated doctor today. Many are available within 24 hours. That's ZocDoc.com/appstories. ZocDoc.com/appstories. Our thanks to ZocDoc for their support of the show.
One last thing before I'm gonna let you ask me questions about S-GPT because I don't even know where to start.
Okay.
How does Raindrop, and if you can tell, I'm very curious about this new Raindrop native experience. How do you think it compares to, for example, capturing links in Notion?
I like it better. I mean, I've tried to do that. Notion for me. So you and I have both been experimenting with Notion.
Yeah.
I've found that it's very good at certain things. It's very good at highly structured data. Like I'm tracking a calendar, right? A calendar with basically a database of all of our advertising stuff. And it's really good for something like that because I can view it as a table. I can view it as a calendar. I can view it as a list. A lot of ways I can filter and sort and navigate all of that data that I've got. For links, it's pretty good, but I really prefer having, I don't know what it is. I think part of it for me is Notion I still find very clunky to navigate the blocks and to get out what I want. It just doesn't click with me for saving links or writing notes for that matter. So I've kind of backed off on moving more of my note taking or more of my research into Notion. And I prefer having it in a structure like Raindrop where I can kind of fit it better, I think, to the way I work. Now it's, you can do that with Notion too, I suppose. It's just a preference thing more than anything else. I've got the ability to very quickly right click on a story and create a permanent copy inside of Raindrop. So I have basically the web archive available to me. I've got, I can quickly create copy the link to the clipboard. I can read in there. It's got pretty good reading environment. Things like that, I think, kind of set it above Notion, where Notion, it's more like you have a list of links that you can view in different ways as a list or as thumbnails or whatever it happens to be. But I feel like I've got more control over how I'm using those links when I'm in Raindrop.
Yeah.
The one thing that I think the shortcoming of Raindrop more than anything is its lack of integration with shortcuts. Hopefully that comes someday because I think it's the kind of app that really could use it. It's what, that's a good reason to stick with something like Good Links, for instance. But there are ways to get around it, like I did with my shortcuts. But it really could use better ties into the rest of Apple's systems.
Yeah, the one thing I really like about Notion is that it's got a web API, so it allows me to. We mentioned this before, but it lets me save ideas and notes without having to open Notion. And over the past few months, I've found that really beneficial, especially when it comes to saving ideas from a shortcut on my home screen or the Apple Watch, from the watch face on the Apple Watch. Just run a shortcut called append to Notion, and it uses the Notion API. And later, when I'm at my computer and I open the note, I find that line of text already in there. Whereas with Obsidian, because it doesn't have a web service, I cannot do that. For example, on the watch, I gotta do it on the iPhone. But even when I do, it still opens the Obsidian app. So, but over time, I'm also realizing that in many ways, and I knew this going into Notion. In many ways, Notion is overkill for what I do as a single user in my own personal workspace. Because ultimately, like what I like about Notion, and I've been working this way for the past few weeks, what I like about it, for example, when I sat down a few weeks ago to write my overview of iOS 16.4, I had Obsidian open on one side, Notion open on the other. And in Notion, I just looked at all the links that I had saved that had been tagged 16.4, and then I went through feature by feature as I was working on the story in Obsidian. But that's like that ability, I could might as well just replicate it in Raindrop, right? It's just in any link organizer that supports adding tags to links. Like that's not a Notion thing. The beauty of Notion is when all these pieces come together. But ultimately, I still prefer to write my markdown stories in Obsidian, right?
Yeah, same.
So I would very much, I think, over the past 4 months or so, I've realized I still like Obsidian. I love Markdown too much to ever give it up. And especially because I'm so capricious when it comes about the plugins and the Markdown and the hotkeys that I have. But I still need that web capture, even for just a single note that I have, my on my mind note, which is like my brain dump note. Just I want to be able to have a place where that note I can easily append stuff to. And so, it's a work in progress.
Well, and that's a very important point, I think, because I'm kind of the same way. I don't like the fact that I can't get something into Obsidian in a note without having to then open the app and get it to sync and all that stuff. I've been on the lookout for some sort of text editor that will allow me to do what you're doing with Notion.
My question for you is, so let's say you're out and you're taking a walk and you have an idea. What do you do? Like, what's the easiest way on your phone to save that?
Right now, I don't have a good solution right now. Right now, I just open up Obsidian and put it in on my phone or something like that. Or I set myself a reminder for like a time.
Yeah, that's what I thought you were going to say. Like you just...
an hour later when I'm going to be home that I'll get reminded by reminders and I'll then put it in somewhere else. And that's not great. I agree with you. I think that now the links are a different thing. Raindrop, one of the reasons I picked Raindrop is because it has so many good ways to get things into it. It's got this URL scheme. It's got a really good Safari extension.
Maybe this is gonna sound stupid, but maybe the solution is to bookmark in Raindrop a text file in Dropbox, and you can append your ideas to that text file in Dropbox.
I suppose that's possible. That's where my mind's going, is down those kinds of avenues. It used to be that we had more web-based text editors because of the old, the Dropbox-based text editors. That doesn't really exist much anymore. I actually found myself looking at Simple Note recently.
Ooh. Okay, yeah,
remember?
Isn't that owned by?
It's owned by Automatic, which I totally forgot, and it's kind of semi shut down. Like they kind of have a web page.
I thought you were gonna say it's still around, and I was about to
still around, but there's kind of like this plea on the website for people to donate money to keep it going type of thing. And I thought, this doesn't
I can donate money. I can keep it going. No, because honestly, like what I want. Okay, so follow me on this. What I want is something that I have access to natively on all my devices, on the iPhone, on the iPad, on Mac and PC, I guess, whatever. Like, let me have a native access to a note. But it also needs to be accessible via the web, and it's got to have an API for me to append stuff to. Again, it doesn't have to be a whole structure of notes. It can be one note.
Yeah, I agree. One note that I can point at my local system where I keep my Mac Stories vault. Yeah, I agree with you 100%. Yeah, the last blog post in Simple Notes blog is help support Simple Note, introducing Simple Note sustainer plans.
Oh, God.
I was like,
okay.
So I don't know, take it for what it's worth. I haven't really investigated it deeply, so I don't know how active this is being used for people, by people, but they have a $20 a month or a $200 a year plan, and a FAQ about why it's an FAQ about why it's so expensive.
It's surprisingly tricky to find a tool that has native apps everywhere, but also has an API that you can use from shortcuts. Okay, we'll keep thinking about this. This is good. I didn't think we were going to talk about this today. So S-GPT, quick introduction, I guess. But so in case you missed it on Mac Stories, I built a shortcut called S-GPT. It stands for Shortcuts GPT, that lets you use the ChatGPT API to have conversations with OpenAI's assistant on your iPhone, iPad, Mac, and Apple Watch. You probably have seen other shortcuts like this one before. This one is using the brand new ChatGPT Chat Completion API, which is the latest API by OpenAI that lets you have a full-on back-and-forth conversation with ChatGPT. But what makes S-GPT special is that it's a hybrid shortcut that has both the ChatGPT integration as well as support for native functionalities on Apple platforms. For example, it integrates with the clipboard, so you can process text from your system clipboard. It can check your reminders and calendar for your schedule. It can process live text extracted from photos. And of course, it can also create playlists in the music app, starting from song recommendations coming from ChatGPT. The idea being that I wanted to have not just yet another shortcut to have conversations with ChatGPT. It does all that, but I wanted to go beyond. And I was looking at what Microsoft is doing by really tightly integrating ChatGPT on Windows with what they call Copilot. They're basically bringing Copilot to all of their software. And I started wondering, I kind of wonder what would happen if it was possible to integrate the intelligence of a large language model directly with the Apple operating system, right? Whether it's iOS, iPadOS, or macOS. Like, what would happen if ChatGPT could process your data from your computer or make stuff happen on your computer instead of just answering trivia questions? So that was the pitch, and that's sort of what you can expect from this first version of SGPT. And like I said, on Mac Stories, I have a bunch more features coming exactly in this sort of with this line of thinking of you can have conversations with ChatGPT, but the real potential, in my opinion, lies in integrating that intelligence with your computer. So I teased already the idea of, well, what if ChatGPT could, after the necessary confirmation steps, what if it could run terminal commands or Apple scripts on your Mac? That's one of the things I'm thinking about. What questions do you have for me, John?
I think that when you first see what you've created, it's kind of mind-blowing in the sense that you think to yourself, how could shortcuts be doing this? Because it goes so far beyond, the results are so far beyond what anybody who's used shortcuts before thinks is possible. For instance, one of the, I guess, the marquee features of SGPT is the fact that you can ask it for a playlist, and it will not only return you a list of songs, but it will create the playlist and save it in Apple Music. So you can go in there and you'll see, here's the playlist with, a title, and it's authored by S-GPT, which I think is kind of funny. And it's not just that you can say, give me 10 songs by REM. You can say, I don't know, give me, I think the conversation that we had is like you and I were going back and forth one night, and you're like, you were creating these playlists with like Phoebe Bridgers songs and stuff. And I said, try seeing if it will create a playlist of songs from the members of Boy Genius, which is a supergroup composed of Phoebe Bridgers and Julianne Baker and Lucy Dacus. And it can do that because ChatGPT can go layers down. It not only understands what are the songs by this band you mentioned, but what are songs by the people who are members of this band have done separate and apart from this existing band, which is pretty mind-blowing. And I guess the thing that I think, when I think about it, the reason this works is because it's all text-based. All you're doing, I know it's complicated under the hood, but what you're doing is you're taking the power of shortcuts to use text to do an action on your devices, sending requests to ChatGPT, which then returns text, which in turn can be used by shortcuts again to do something like create that playlist. And that's kind of where the magic happens, is the fact that you're processing text on both ends and using ChatGPT to leverage what's not possible in shortcuts itself, which doesn't handle those kinds of multi-layer requests.
Yeah, a good example of this, like this idea of the multi-layer request, it's possible because here we're not just talking to Siri, we're not just issuing a specific request to Siri. You have a large language model which is able to infer the context of what you mean, and which is also able to sort of make sense of your query, as you said, layer by layer down. So, for example, another good example that I just tested, and it totally works with ChatGPT, is what's a popular song by the former partner of Zooey Deschanel? And of course, ChatGPT responded. The former partner of Zooey Deschanel is Ben Gibbard, who is also the lead vocalist and guitarist of the band Death Cab for Cutie. One of their most popular songs is I Will Follow You Into the Dark. So this is the kind of natural language query where you might be talking to somebody and be like, hey, what's the name of the guy that used to date Zooey Deschanel and plays for some band, right? That's totally a thing that you would ask a friend, right?
Right.
It's not the kind of thing that you can ask Siri, because it doesn't have that idea of like, wait, what are you asking here? Are you asking about a song? Are you asking about an actress? Are you asking about somebody? Like, Siri doesn't know the context and like humans and the human brain, I suppose. The way our real, like our own neural network is supposed to work is we're able to infer the connections when we talk to somebody else and be like for example, if I ask you, John, hey, do you feel like going for a walk even though we gotta do the thing? And your brain is able to infer like Federico by the thing means we gotta work on this specific project. Like we are able to contextualize a lot of information that a computer typically wouldn't be able to contextualize. A large language model and it's getting better and better over time, is able to make all of these types of inferences about the context of your query. And so that, I think, makes the playlist integration really fun and a really good feature to have in version 1.0 of this, because it's got broad appeal, right? And it's fun, and it's remarkable how it works. Like you can ask,
it really is.
You can ask stuff like, I'm feeling sad and I'm looking for some emo songs, but they have to be released between 2005 and 2010. And please group them by year and sort them under each year alphabetically. It's a super long query in natural language, but it'll work if you try it.
Yeah.
So
I think it's a great example, because it's like even beyond the one that I mentioned, which is just kind of like creating a family tree of who the members of Boy Genius are. Saying that it's a sad song is really just like the old Beats sentence, right? It's a vibe thing, which is just contextual and very indefinite in terms of an instruction, but it can handle that kind of thing.
Yeah. So that's I think the feature of version 1.0. Of course, I think it's also just fun to be able to have conversations. Like I keep S-GPT in my dock on the iPad, and it's really useful to do the occasional grammar or spell check on like a couple of paragraphs of text. Of course, you are limited in your requests to the ChatGPT API. You are limited to 4,000 tokens. Now, the idea of a token is not a word. They're not even syllables necessarily. But suffice to say, usually, and this is going to be inaccurate to an extent, but usually I would recommend you stay below 1,500 words in your requests to the ChatGPT API. You should be fine. Usually, that's the threshold for what's the equivalent of 4,000 tokens in OpenAI's terminology. My recommendation would be you're going to be fine if you stay around 1,000 words in your requests. But yeah, it's usually like I take a couple of paragraphs from Obsidian and I say, hey, check my clipboard for grammar mistakes, right? And that's one of the things that I do most often with S-GPT. But I look forward to being able to make it a more powerful companion on desktop, especially, which is why you're probably going to see me use macOS more and more over the coming months. I mean, Stage Manager is also a concern on that front on iPadOS.
Yeah.
But the idea of like, I don't know, imagine being able to say something like, hey, here's my list of open windows. Can you sort them alphabetically and then display them in a grid? Like that sort of thing is what I'm thinking about. Like, hey, here's my data from my computer, like the windows I'm looking at. Can you arrange them by alphabetical order and in an equal grid? And so
that's really cool.
That hybrid approach comes into play here. Like, yeah, ChatGPT, of course. ChatGPT cannot touch your windows. ChatGPT can only see a list of names of your windows, and it can sort them. But then it's up to shortcuts to say, okay, I'm going to arrange windows, move them around. So this hybrid approach, use the brain in the cloud, but the engine locally, that's what you can expect from S-GPT going forward.
Yeah, and I think the big picture thing here is that I think we'll see even more powerful things coming out of native apps that integrate ChatGPT in the long run, because Shortcuts does have its own limitations. It's just like if you tried to build yourself a text editor in Shortcuts, you can kind of do it. I mean, but you wouldn't want to use it over a native text editor, right? Exactly. And the fact that you can build in ChatGPT is fantastic too, and takes Shortcuts to a whole different level. But once ChatGPT is funneled into a very specific domain and used to leverage features in a native app that developers make, and then we're already seeing this in a lot of the apps that we're reviewing and getting, it's going to really take these apps a lot further. All right, Federico, that is it for this week. Good conversation. Everybody should continue to stop by the website and see what we're doing for Automation April. We also have on Mastodon an account set up for Automation April. It's at Automation April.
Couldn't be easier. At Automation April at macstories.net. That's it. Yes.
Exactly. I want to thank our sponsor for this week's episode. That's ZocDoc. You can find Federico and me over on MacStories and on Mastodon too. For Mastodon, Federico is vitici.macstories.net. Just go to that website and you'll find a follow button to follow him. And you can find me at johnvorhees.macstories.net. You can also find us over on Instagram. Federico is at Vitici. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.